Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Madeline Brosen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and we're really thrilled to have everyone here to join us for this afternoon's book talk with Bill Fulton. We're going to, before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the UCLA campus presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the peoples who use the names today, Tongva, Gabrielino, and Kitsch. To give you a sense of our program for this afternoon, Bill Fulton is going to give us an overview of his most recent book, Place and Prosperity. He'll chat for about 40 minutes. And then he'll be joined by Lewis Center Associate Faculty Director, Michael Lenz. Michael and Bill will have a short conversation with some questions, and then we'll give everyone a chance to send your questions. As a reminder, please send those to the Q&A box. If you have any technical questions, you can chat at our events team for that. So before I hand it over to Bill, I want to introduce him. Bill Fulton is an AICP and one of the nation's leading thinkers on urban planning and land use. He serves as a senior advisor to PFM Management and Budget Consulting Group. We're really pleased and privileged to have Bill as a member of the Lewis Center Advisory Board. He serves in this role at other universities throughout the country, including the Turner Center for Innovation at UC Berkeley. He's an adjunct assistant professor at the LGBT School of Public Affairs, the University of Texas at Austin. Before these current roles, Bill was the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. He's had a number of roles both in practice and academia, including the director of planning economic development for the City of San Diego, the mayor and council member for the city of Ventura. Bill's written and thought a lot about these issues. He, is the author of the Guide to California Planning, which is the standard land use textbook. If you have not read it, it is a great resource for wrapping your head around the crazy land use system that we have here in California. Among other things, Bill is an alumni of the UCLA Urban Planning Master's Program. Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us, Connect Us, and Innovate is Bill's 8th book. So he's a quite notable author, and we're glad to welcome here today to share his work. So with that, Bill, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Maddie, and I hope you can all hear me. It's a privilege to be, as Maddie said, I am a graduate of the Master's in Urban Planning program and an advisory board member of the Lewis Center. So it is my privilege to be here today to talk to you about this book. I just want to, at the outset, say this is a pretty personal presentation on my part. Much of the book is pretty personal and talks about how I became an urbanist. The first chapter actually is called The Making of an Urbanist, which I tried to get them to call that the name of the book. I'm going to try to share my screen now. That means I'm going to shut down the other screen sharing. I hope that's okay. So I'm going to, okay, and here's my screen. Everybody can see that now? Okay. For many, many years, I've wanted to write a book, all the way back to when I was on the council in Ventura, which is, like 15 years now. I've wanted to write a book called Place and Prosperity, because those are really the two things that have always come together to shape who I am and what I've tried to convey. I have two jobs. I'm a land use planner and I'm an economic developer. And really, place and prosperity are those two sides of the same coin. And I've always been interested in understanding how they interact with one another, and how they relate to one another, and how they shape the world that we live in. And the other thing I would say about this book, this is probably not true of this audience, because this audience is made up of people, I'm sure, who are very aware of the built environment. But one of the things that I say in this book is that most people don't realize they experience place all the time, every minute of every day, always traveling through space, without realizing that both that the places that we live in and work in and otherwise occupy are the result of deliberate political and economic decisions that we can participate in. So that's just a little bit of a précis. My thought about this book really got started many years ago when I was the economic development columnist for Governing magazine, which is the leading magazine for state and local governments in the country. We had a joke at Governing where my job was to always write about the latest fad in economic development, which could be a football stadium, it could be a convention center, that's the Las Vegas Convention Center, or it could be an auto assembly plant, and that's the giant Volkswagen auto assembly plant in Chattanooga. And my job was to take that fad and write about how it's not a panacea for economic development, that there was no one thing that made a community prosperous. You couldn't bank on the one thing. They used to call me the panacea editor because my job was to write over and over again that whatever we were writing about was not a panacea. So as I was thinking about that, I got to thinking about my hometown and how that shapes me, not only as an urbanist, but as somebody thinking about economic development and the relationship between place and prosperity. This image, which comes from a postcard, is in my hometown, Auburn, New York. This is obviously a little bit before my time, but this is what it looked like when I was a kid. The downtown of my hometown, that theater is still there, though it's in bad shape, and the clock tower is still there. This is in central New York. It's near Cornell. Auburn was a factory town near Cornell. And it was a prosperous when I was a kid, it was a prosperous little factory town. And it also had a thriving downtown. Now, just about everything happened downtown. As I like to say, as I say in the book, I don't ever remember, for example, as a kid, and this is quite a while ago now, I realize going to the doctor's office anywhere but in one of those upper stories in the downtown. And it was a very tight-knit little town, not only physically, but also sociologically. There were a series of ethnic groups that worked in the factories: Ukrainians, Poles, Italians, Irish. It's still one of the leading Ukrainian towns in the U.S. Also, a significant Black population. This was the town in the north where Harriet Tubman settled, and her residence, the Harriet Tubman home, is only a few miles from where I grew up. So it was, and as you can see, for those of you who are physical planners, this was laid out in the 19th century, and it was a very, very tightly packed downtown in particular. But it was a long time before I began to understand the relationship between place and prosperity. That the vibrant place I knew as I was a kid, and that's what it looked like, was the result of and deeply connected to local prosperity. So, for example, the biggest factory in my hometown was this one. It no longer exists. It was a beautiful factory. It was the Colombian Rope Company, one of the largest rope manufacturing companies in the world, one in which quite literally the twine went all the way around the factory as it was converted into rope. It was very beautiful in its own way. And it had, believe it or not, in this little town in upstate New York, it had its own R&D lab with a bunch of chemists. And those chemists actually were led by my grandfather, Edgar Johnson, who started the R&D lab at Colombian Rope and ran it for 30 years. He was trained in chemistry at Cornell, and he came nearby. So the basis of this economic prosperity was embedded even in my own family. And one of the things I didn't appreciate until I was older, is how sophisticated the manufacturing process was in Auburn, that what undergirded the prosperity that I saw as a little kid every day in the downtown was a very sophisticated economic process and set of economic development decisions. And it was later on that I began to really notice this connection between place and prosperity. And I know, for example, I noticed when I was a kid, I drove with my mother to visit relatives all over upstate New York. And one of the things I noticed was that every small town, say 10,000 people or less, that had a prosperous downtown like this one, and this is Greene, New York, which is a really beautiful downtown near Binghamton, always had on the edge of town a successful factory. This is a forklift factory about a mile away from that. Here's the downtown, here's the factory. And I began to realize as I rode through these towns with my mother when I was a kid, that there was a relationship between this vibrant place in the downtown and the prosperity created by factories. And quite the opposite was also true. You would drive through a town where because there were no interstates, so we were driving through the center of every city, or we were cutting across to not use the interstate. Quite literally, if there was if the downtown was in decline and you drove to the edge of town, you would see a factory that was vacant. So I began to understand at an early age this relationship between place and prosperity. But then something rather sad happened to this tight-knit little town of mine in the 1970s as I was in college and a young adult. This is what it looked like when I was a little kid. Then what happened was there was both urban renewal and the New York State Department of Transportation built an arterial, both right through the downtown. You begin to see how the grid, I know this is physical planning 101, you see how the grid began to be diminished as quite quickly. This is what it looked like in, 1973. This is what it looked like in 1975. And this is what it looked like an aerial view. You can see there is a loop road being built around the downtown core. And then 1 block away, New York State Department of Transportation is building a big arterial that blew out a lot of working class neighborhoods. And in the book, I tell the story about how I actually, when I was a young college kid, I went to my first city council meeting. This is when I first got hooked on city council meetings and urban planning. I literally walked out of the office of the newspaper office. I was a young reporter in college, which was down at the bottom of this picture, and I walked to the city hall, which is pretty obvious what building it is on the top side of the picture, and it was like walking through a war zone. It was like walking through a war zone. I was walking through these 2 big construction projects. Plus, at the time, they were also separating the sewers, all done with federal money to try to save this town. And I went to the meeting of the city council meeting as the Urban Renewal Authority. And the discussion they had was, what do we do about, we have scraped the most important parcel in town. You see where the big parking lot is on the left. And what do we do because we can't find any developers who are interested in coming in and developing that site. That was literally my introduction to urban planning at the age of 18 as a young reporter, not only covering the meeting where they didn't know what to do, but also walking through the what seemed like a war zone to get to the meeting in the first place. It was only years later that I realized that I had experienced, like many other people in my hometown and many other people in that era, I had experienced the kind of urban renewal PTSD. Like many cities, we had a Flatiron building. This is the Flatiron building being demolished in 1975. And this really affected me in more ways than I can possibly imagine. And that's part of the reason I realized I came to be an urban planner, which was because I felt it was necessary to try to work to heal all of these wounds that I and so many other people felt during the urban renewal era. So what did I do after growing up in upstate New York and experiencing all these little urban gems all over upstate New York? I moved as far away as possible to a place that to me at the time didn't seem the least bit urban. And that, of course, was Los Angeles. It was just so different to me from anything I had experienced growing up. This is the famous grid looking south from the Hollywood Hills. You see the Coliseum there on the bottom of the screen. But my point is, having experienced this urban renewal PTSD, I felt the need to run away from it as far as I could and get to a place that was as different as possible. And at first, when I got here, I thought, man, this is not a city. This is not urban. A lot of people felt that way in those days. And then gradually I came to realize that something was happening that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, which is that not only did Los Angeles have great urban bones in old downtowns, because there are something like 60 old downtowns, but those old downtowns are beginning to come back. This is, of course, downtown Pasadena. I can remember doing a project in 1985, right after I got out of planning school, where I went to visit the original guy who invested in the renovation of downtown Pasadena. And I know this is hard to believe today. He had a fabulous condo above a store in downtown Pasadena. I literally had to walk over broken glass to get to the front door to get to his fabulous condo. But to me, the amazing thing, having grown up in Auburn, was that there were urban gems elsewhere, and they were not in decline. They were rising. And of course, the rise of these urban gems has created a whole different set of problems, but nevertheless, it's something I never thought I'd experience. I experienced it in Pasadena, and especially in Santa Monica, where I spent a lot of time when I was in school, and I wrote my master's thesis at UCLA about Santa Monica. And eventually, as I looked around, I found another small city with a good downtown. This, of course, is Main Street in Ventura, where I lived for 25 years and was on the city council for 8. And although it's not really part of the Los Angeles old red car legacy of downtowns, it is a beautiful old downtown. And the more I thought about it, and you'll notice the logo on the jacket I'm wearing, the more I thought about it, the more I realized, again, here was a beautiful downtown that was coming back, and immediately adjacent to the downtown was a very prosperous company, which you see at the bottom of the screen here. That is the corporate headquarters of Patagonia, in which renovated those old industrial buildings. And it was, again, the qualities of place that contributed to prosperity. The reason that Patagonia is in Ventura is not the bottom part of the picture, but the top part of the picture, because of Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, who recently donated the entire company worth $3 billion to charity to fight climate change. Yvon liked to surf, and C Street in Ventura is a great surf spot. And so he wanted to locate his company in this old downtown immediately adjacent to the surf. So that reinforced to me the idea that place and prosperity go together. Now, over time, I came to realize that the most basic, and this is really where the economic development part of it comes in, we as planners tend to think that the most basic reason city exists is to bring people together for daily living. Everybody, all urban planners want people to, be able to walk to the coffee shop, walk to the store, interact with each other on a daily basis. But that's not the fundamental reason that cities exist. In my view, I came to realize that the most basic reason cities exist is to facilitate commerce, to do so in a time efficient and a resource efficient manner. That's why cities exist, to facilitate commerce. And when I was a small business owner in Ventura, running Solomar Research Group, I just loved the fact that people came from all over town every day to work in the office at Solomar to facilitate commerce, to send out into the world work products that were good work products that helped cities everywhere, and yet also brought money and therefore prosperity back to Ventura. The other thing I realized when I lived in California was that I saw how other people also had urban PTSD. This is, as I'm sure you know, the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco before the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the clock tower there is the ferry building, which was for 30 years completely separated from the downtown by a double-decker freeway. And I saw how it was possible to heal urban PTSD. I misspelled PTSD there. I'm sorry. I saw how it is possible to heal urban PTSD under the right circumstances. And this, of course, is the Embarcadero today. The freeway fell down in the Loma Prieta earthquake more than 30 years ago. The city did not rebuild the freeway, but in fact built the boulevard. And and the Ferry building today is a beautiful and incredibly successful retail building. Of course, after I lived in LA and Ventura, I challenged myself, or something challenged me. I went and lived and moved to a city with no zoning. And it really challenged to me the question of whether place and prosperity really go together. I will say not everybody in Houston has a roller coaster in their backyard. I don't have one, for example, although I do live adjacent to shops and to restaurants and to apartment buildings, and I live in a townhome. I went and moved to a city with no zoning, which had been prosperous for over 100 years, even though it probably, one would think on the surface, had fewer place amenities than any other city I'd ever seen, because so much of it looks like this. But I came to a city that did not value pedestrians. As many of you know, I'm visually impaired. I don't drive anymore. So being a pedestrian has always been, to me, the essence of urbanity and the essence of place. So difficult is it to walk in Houston that Rice University, my former employer, actually puts these signs up all around the campus. There are no similar signs, by the way, telling cars to watch out for pedestrians. Even so, eventually I realized that in Houston, place matters, even in a city where I didn't think it was valued. And this is Buffalo Bayou Park, adjacent to downtown Houston, one of the most popular public spaces that I've ever seen. And I think that what we realize is place and prosperity still go together. There is concern on the part of business leaders in Houston that unless they up their game on place amenities, they will not be able to attract and retain talent like they used to be able to. And there is concern as well to make sure that this kind of place amenity is equitably distributed around the city, which, as in most cities, it is not. So, as I say, not all good places are prosperous, and not all prosperous places are well designed. But the interesting thing is, when you see a new level of prosperity, you begin to see it occur first in locations with good place amenities. Another thing I've learned over the years is that cities reinvent themselves all the time. We have a tendency to think from the suburban era that you build out the suburb and that's the end of it and it's over. This, of course, is not true. We see this in shopping centers all the time. But this is a street in the downtown when I was a kid. In my hometown, this is that same block from a different angle today. This is a part of the downtown that was not destroyed by urban renewal and is really thriving. That brewery in the front picture is incredibly successful. Is an incredibly successful regional brewery. Now, the idea that you would have at this time in this picture, when I was a kid, that you would have a brewery on that corner was unimaginable, yet here it is today, because cities reinvent themselves. And as I say, when prosperity begins to return to a city that has declined, it goes first to the locations with strong place amenities. So in conclusion, this is still my favorite street, Main Street in downtown Ventura. And recently, actually, in a convergence of place and prosperity, it's a place that can be used for different things at different times. It can be capable of welcoming back a hometown boy. This is probably the most famous person who grew up in Ventura. It's a place where you can celebrate an inflatable green pig on St. Patrick's Day. This is the St. Patrick's Day parade. This inflatable green pig was named Sham Hawk. Tragically, Sham Hawk deflated in front of the viewing stand on the St. Patrick's Day parade a couple of years ago. They actually gave him a funeral. And what's really interesting is that this street today has reinvented itself as a center of both place and prosperity. It was shut down to facilitate commerce during COVID, and that has now become permanent. So that's really all I wanted to say. It really is about my personal journey. There are many things that are in the book that I haven't talked about. I'd be happy to discuss them in the Q&A. If you go to Island Press and you use the discount code Fulton, you can get this book for 20% off. As I say, that the book contains many, many things I've written over a long period of time. There's a whole section about California in it. And as I say, there's many things that we could talk about, and I look forward to talking to Mike and to you about that over the next little while. So thanks very much, and I will stop sharing my screen. And I see that Mike is here now, apparently. Hey, Mike.
Hello, Bill. Hello, audience. Sorry for my delay in joining, but even as wondrous as Zoom is, it can't put me in two different meetings at the same time, and one went long. So I know that obviously, Bill, you've been introduced. I don't need to redo that, but I did want to connect before I get into some questions of my own. I did want to kind of connect my journey just a little bit in Los Angeles to certainly your previous book, The Reluctant Metropolis, and then just kind of talk about how I enjoyed reading this one, Place and Prosperity. So, I think anybody who has studied or practiced planning in Los Angeles should know Bill from at least his first book, The Reluctant Metropolis, which was published in 1997. And, for me, it was really an amazing introduction to Los Angeles as somebody who never lived here, but also somebody who had never practiced planning anywhere before I had moved to UCLA to be a professor of planning. And so it's an introduction to this sprawling region that doesn't make sense unless you really kind of study it and go various places through it. And so this book for me included really invaluable insights for me from the perspective of both a skillful city manager, but also a trained planner's perspective on kind of broader issues than more than just what affected Bill's world as a mayor of Ventura. And of course, it doesn't hurt that in this book, Place and Prosperity, as well as The Reluctant Metropolis, that Bill was a journalist for many years, and so can communicate these thoughts through clear and compelling writing. And so, for me, this book, Place and Prosperity, you see again this rich and clear writing about so many different topics that are key to urban development and relevant to so many of our discussions today about cities, chiefly economic development, how place obviously connects to prosperity and commerce and the things that Bill was just talking to us about. So, I think, there's so many things I want to get further into, but, the clearest, one of the things that you touch on late in the book went in on a chapter on Houston's gentrification problem is that you say places are improved by prosperity, but in a society with deepening inequality, places can also be overrun by prosperity. So can you talk about what this looks like maybe in Houston and Los Angeles and how those cities and regions are handling that differently?
I think anybody who's paying attention to American cities today knows what that looks like.
Yeah.
It looks like some, and in the conclusion of the book, I talk about how I live in a very high amenity neighborhood in Houston, and within 15 blocks at least, there are very low amenity neighborhoods where it is almost impossible to buy anything. So what we see is, and Houston and LA, I would say, Mike, Houston's probably more like LA than it is like any other American city. If you look at the urban morphology, right? Auto-oriented, big grid, sprawling, just endless. But what's really interesting to me is the view that the understandable view on the part of people who live in traditionally minority neighborhoods that have gone overlooked, that investment is bad. And one of the things I try to say is investment is not bad per se. It's how you use it and who benefits from it and who doesn't. It seems to me that the whole economic development angle has changed. Used to be the question in economic development where you often see cities subsidizing businesses. The question used to be who pays, right? And I think that's flipped around now. So the fundamental question of economic development now is who benefits. So if you bring in a business, and we see this in Texas a lot, you bring in a business, the business has a lot of high-end jobs. You have to import the workers from somewhere else. What have you really accomplished, right? You've created some service jobs in retail and so forth, but have you really furthered the prosperity, the long-term and enduring prosperity of that community? I think the answer is no. I will say, and this is I'm sorry to say this, but I will say that I think the issue of inequality is such an enormous and deeply embedded issue in the structure of American society. It is almost impossible for cities and urban planners to fix it, right? You often see urban thinkers on the right, such as Joel Kotkin, say, well, cities used to be vehicles for middle-class upward mobility, and now they're not. And I kind of think that's almost a symptom rather than a cause, right? But I do think that it is incumbent on planners to do everything they can to try to level the playing field and make sure that that investment, in particular public investment, and this is happening all over the country now, flows into neighborhoods that have been traditionally overlooked, as well as those that are not. And then you have to engage in mitigating strategies to make sure that the people who live in those communities now do in fact benefit from those investments rather than get displaced by them.
So I guess I have a broader question, some of which you definitely touched on, but how does Los Angeles figure into your growth or development as an urbanist? And before we answer that, I want to make sure that all of the audience knows that we would love to hear your questions. Just throw them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get them.
Well, you saw my depictions of the town I grew up in, and upstate New York is littered with towns like that, right? As is the Northeast and the Midwest. And when I came to Los Angeles, it was like landing on Mars. And I used to say I felt like I was living on Mars even after I married a Martian. And the reluctant metropolis was very much just my attempt to figure out LA as a city. I basically, in retrospect, I started working on the ideas for the reluctant metropolis almost the day I arrived. And it took me 16 years to write the book, really, and figure it out. LA gave me a much more nuanced appreciation for urban life. And it caused, and there were a lot of other pieces of literature that caused me to think about this, as well as my own research. I think, for example, of Magnetic Los Angeles by Greg Heiss, where he deconstructed the development of LA and made it clear that this was not random sprawl. There was a very deliberate decision to build a lot of small communities that had a factory of some kind, including the studios, which are factories, surrounding residential neighborhoods and adjacent commercial. So it gave me a much more nuanced understanding of urban life, and it also made me realize I reflected a lot on the role immigration plays in city building and the role that city building plays in facilitating the upward mobility of immigrants. And I found a lot of similarities, actually, interestingly, between the Southern and Eastern Europeans who emigrated to the Northeast and the Midwest to work in the factories in the early 20th century, and those who've emigrated, particularly from Latin America and Asia, in the last few decades. those communities tend to be very culturally strong. They maintain their traditional culture for a long time. It's just really interesting to see the similarities. For example, when I was in Ventura and I would visit the Latinx neighborhoods in Ventura, it really struck me how similar they were in some ways to the Italian neighborhoods I knew when I was growing up.
That makes sense. That's interesting. I think one other insight early in the book that really stuck with me right away is you talk about how self-contained the Auburn was of your youth, and I don't know if I'd ever seen kind of that phrasing, and it just kind of immediately made some sense. I grew up probably after the heyday of small cities having that kind of feature where everybody kind of lives and works in this town, and there's not much need to leave. When you're talking about this nuanced idea of urbanism or city life that you just talked about, developing in your mind in your consumption of Los Angeles, did you find that Ventura or Pasadena or the small kind of fiefdoms in between or neighborhoods in between kind of reflected that self-contained aspect, or had lost something important along the way in their development?
Well, obviously, what's happened over time in a place like LA is that there's much more commuting from one center to another than there would be in another place, in a self-contained little town. So people drive long distances to work, or at least they used to before COVID. And one of the interesting questions is, will the pandemic bring that back? But what I found studying Santa Monica, as I did intensely over the years, what I found in Ventura was that, yes, in fact, those communities that were smallish in scale, the neighborhoods that were smallish in scale and had a variety of things within a close range, actually were pretty self-contained. And the thing I can remember writing about this when I was mayor of Ventura, that the thing that was most precious to me about Ventura was that most of the people who worked there also lived there at that time. And of course, that was deteriorating for a variety of reasons, but that was maybe the single most precious thing I thought you could possibly try to retain. Was that so that, I mean, Ventura is a city of 100,000 people. It's got 60,000 jobs. So it's not an insignificant city. But 30 or 40,000 of those jobs were people who lived in town. And that meant instead of being on a commute, they were at the soccer game after work or something like that. That was, having grown up in Auburn and seen that, when I landed in West LA and studied Santa Monica, and especially after I moved to Ventura, that was the single most precious thing that I thought was at risk in these communities in Southern California, and obviously is still at risk. That's a really interesting observation, Mike.
Cool. And just as an aside, I need to spend more time in Ventura. My friends call me Professor Patagonia because of the amount of Patagonia wear, and I see that you are representing the.
I am, and that you can kind of, there is a not only is there a good Patagonia store at the factory, there's also an outlet store in downtown Ventura, Real Cheap Sports, which is where Patagonia. That's worth the trip to Ventura all by itself. That's on Main Street? No, it's off of Main Street. It's on Santa Clara. So it's about 3 blocks from the headquarters. Oh, this sounds like my paradise. Okay. I'm going to get to some of the audience questions. Yeah, great. And please, folks, chime in with more. I think we have some time to get to most of them, if not all. So the first, and I'm going to butcher people's names, I'm sorry. The first question is from Wally Simbab. Wally Simbab. Wally Simbab. Okay, you helped me. You know Wally. Wally asks, Bill, what are the options today beyond local amenities to play the role of the rope factory of 60 years ago? Well, if I can, hi, Wally. I'm gonna take this deep into economic development and say the whole thing has changed. So 60, 70 years ago, the internal R&D lab at the rope company was an innovation factory, but of course it was a proprietary innovation factory inside of a company. I often reflect on the fact that today, if my grandfather were alive today and he was a chemist at Cornell, and this big rope company came to him and said, run our research lab, he'd say, I don't want to run I don't want to move to run your research lab. I want to do your research here at Cornell, right? And have it more open source. So I think the bottom line there is that there's often been discussion about how eds and meds play that same role that major employers played in the past. I think that's less true now than it was. Eds and meds are major drivers of gentrification, among other things. But I do think that it's the immovable institutions like a Cornell that provide that play that role. And that is what has put cities like Auburn at a disadvantage, because it was highly dependent. It was essentially in the 20th century an economic colony. The corporate headquarters were elsewhere, and the factories were footloose. Now, I didn't mention this, but in the background near the downtown, right adjacent to the downtown in Auburn, is a maximum security prison that's 200 years old. That is the economic anchor of Auburn today, because that is not, it might close down someday, but it's not going to move to Alabama or to Mexico.
No, unfortunately, government demand for incarceration is not abating. And yeah, you do need them geographically proximate to the courthouse and to the people you're incarcerating to some extent.
Right.
That's America. So Jared Schechner has a question. What quantitative measure provides the best proxy for the quality of a neighborhood or city's amenities?
Well, it all depends on what amenities you're looking at, right? To me, the most important amenity is simply, and what separates an urban place from a suburban place, and the urban place doesn't have to be a big city to do this, is the ability to walk. To me, that's what urbanism is all about. It's not having to get in your car. It's maintaining the ability to walk. And that's the difference, for example, between Westwood and Orange County, right? So my question then becomes, what's the proxy for if you have walking the capability and you have some prosperity, you will have neighborhood amenities, and they will be close at hand. So to me, the biggest question is always the biggest question is what's the best measurement of walkability? And there's been a million different ways to try to do this. I still believe the single best measurement of walkability is simply intersection density. I think intersection density is the best proxy for walkability or potential walkability, and intersection density married to disposable income in a neighborhood will usually equal an amenity-rich neighborhood.
And I'm not much of a transportation knowledgeable person, but intersection density sounds like something that is absolutely killed by things like cul-de-sacs, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Because then you have to walk, a mile to go 10 feet, right? Yeah. To go from your house to the school. In my neighborhood in Houston, which has Midtown Houston has a very strong intersection density quotient. In fact, as big developers come into the neighborhood, they are getting the city without any argument to remove side streets so that they can build bigger buildings. There's a Whole Foods that I can walk to, but it's inside. It is on the bottom floor of an apartment building, and to make it all work, they took out a side street. Wow. So I think you have to watch out. You have to watch out for that.
Oh, this is a great question from Howard Blackson III. Who are your favorite writers on urbanism, and specifically, where does Mike Davis and his writing about Los Angeles fit in your canon of great writers?
Well, sorry to say, Mike has left us recently, as most of you probably know. City of Quartz is a great book. It captured Los Angeles at a moment in time. I think Mike was probably too dramatically apocalyptic in his writing. It was hard to find. If you ever talked to Mike or you observed him teaching, he often was constructively engaged in how to make cities better, and particularly how to solve problems that low-wage workers have. If you read his books, you don't get that, right? And I wish that he had written more about that. There's a question down here about Jane Jacobs. I still think that the two books that shaped me, one more than other, the two books that shaped me as I was a young journalist and got interested in urban planning were, in fact, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and also The Power Broker, which came out around the time that I was thinking of becoming a planner. The Power Broker, again, a little bit too relentlessly negative about Robert Moses, because I think that the truth is more nuanced and balanced than that. But as a way of understanding how you pull the levers of power to shape a city, The Power Broker is peerless and is really great. I'm saving the Don Shoup question for later. As usual, he's got the most interesting question. The Jane Jacobs book, right? Jane Jacobs is mostly about neighborhoods and about physical planning and about the sociology of neighborhoods in relationship to the built environment. My favorite story. My favorite story in the Death and Life of Great American Cities is actually in the introduction, or the first chapter, where she goes to Boston and she goes to the North End and she sees this really vibrant Italian neighborhood, and she calls up the city planner, and because they're getting ready to demolish it under urban renewal, and she starts telling him about what a great neighborhood it is, and he keeps looking up all the statistics, and it's like low tuberculosis, long lifespan, everything is great. And he said, and the punchline is that the planner says, "It sounds like a great neighborhood, too bad it's a slum." and I think what I learned from that and from Jane Jacobs is it really isn't only about technical work and isn't only about quantitative data. It's about the touch and feel of communities.
Yeah, for sure. So we definitely need to get to the Donald Shoup question, but yeah, at your leisure. So many of our planning students and they've long become graduates, just like you have. And so they're out in the world as practicing planners. And so certainly not all, but many of these students and planners are hostile to some extent or varying extent to markets and to capitalism more broadly as a way of organizing our societies. And so the focus in your book, in this talk, on commerce and prosperity in cities as dependent upon prosperity or facilitating prosperity and commerce, is certainly is going to come off as pro-market to some people, to the extent that you're describing the world as it should be and not just as it is. So what do you say to students or folks who are very suspicious of markets or very concerned about rising inequality and how this could be seen as like a pro capitalist sort of piece?
Well, I think the bottom line is we have a mixed economy, but we live in a mostly market economy in the United States. That has been true since the beginning of the United States. And I think what we've learned over the last 100 years is that markets properly regulated and properly governed, such as we saw from the 30s through the 70s, can be very effective at providing both prosperity and a measure of social equity. I think it is unlikely that we're going to see a dramatic. So I don't think it's markets themselves that are the problem.
Yeah.
I think it's when too few people have too much market power, and that is not tempered by a regulatory or governance structure that evens that out. But I think it's unrealistic to assume that you can solve major problems, for example, such as housing, entirely without market involvement. And you're on this call, Shane's on this call. Shane could talk about this all day long, much better than me. But it is my view, given the current housing situation in California, for example, that there has to be both a social housing solution and a market solution in order to solve that problem. In fact, I think I'm stealing one of Shane's tweets from the other day when I say that. So I whether or not you like markets exist all over the world. In my observation is that in societies that try to suppress markets pop up in more informal ways.
Yeah.
And so the question is not whether or not markets are bad. The question is how you govern markets so that they're equitable.
Agreed. Do you want to take the Shoup question? What did you learn at UCLA?
I got a sense of social consciousness that has never gone away because I had, Alan Heskin and Dolores Hayden and Ed Soja and all those folks. And I learned a very important lesson from this crazy guy who taught public resource allocation, right? Which was the thing I learned more than anything else from Don himself was, and this helped me later on as Mayor of Ventura when we instituted a paid parking system in downtown Ventura, was sometimes there are public goods that have to be allocated, and they're going to be allocated one way or another. So make an intentional decision about how to allocate them. So, for example, housing vouchers are a public good created by the government, but there aren't enough of them. So how do you allocate them? You use a waiting list, right? In the case of parking, what I walked away from, Don, was there are three ways to allocate parking. One is first come, first serve. The second one is time limits, regulated time limits, and the third one is price. And the thing that I found amusing as a moderate Democrat was when we instituted paid parking in the downtown, the Democrats were all for it, and the Republicans all wanted regulated time limits. And I remember on a Monday night on the dais one night saying to one of my colleagues, "How come you're in favor of regulation and I'm in favor of a market solution?" So I think what I learned at UCLA, and especially from Don, was you have to be intentional about these policy choices, because if you are not intentional and you are making a choice, and by not charging for parking, we are, when there's more demand than supply, we are simply allocating it in a different way. We had a big debate here in Houston recently about whether or not to charge for parking in Herman Park, which is adjacent to the zoo. And there were some people who thought that the parking should be free, even though people use it for reasons other than going to the park, because of the philosophy of parks for all. And I think I learned from Don was that's, free parking does not mean parks for all. It means parking spaces for whoever shows up first.
Yep.
And that's the big lesson I learned.
Well, this gives me as a faculty member a lot more confidence that our students are listening. I mean, it's been a couple of years since you learned these lessons, and they've stuck with you.
They did. We instituted the paid parking in Ventura about 30 years after I took Don's class.
There you go.
And it took that long for the thing to gestate in my mind to the point where I could confidently explain to my suspicious and sometimes hostile constituents that it was a good idea.
Yes, and we've just now reduced parking minimums near transit in
Yes.
California after how
Right.
many decades of
Right.
telling them to do that.
Right.
Pablo with a great question. What do people misunderstand about Houston?
In planning terms, people think that because there is no zoning for use, there is no land use regulation, and that is not true. Houston has about 90% of a typical development code. It has it has parking requirements. It has setback requirements. But the interesting thing that I've learned from my planner friends in Houston is you can experiment, and you because regulation is lighter, you can do things, you can experiment with things. Good things happen faster, bad things happen faster, but it's much more responsive to the market. And I think one of the things we are learning in the United States today is that zoning may well be too prescriptive, right? And that there needs to be more flexibility. And interestingly enough, more and more people are looking at Houston as basically the only model of what you do with a more flexible regulatory structure. What I find is what you see is, number one, a lot more housing production, but you also see the developers building only what they can get financed, which is luxury apartment buildings, relatively for Houston expensive townhomes like the one I live in, and single family homes on the fringe.
Yeah, lots of townhomes, in part because we don't make condo production very easy to finance.
Right. That's another reason why townhomes are popular. Yes.
Right. Oh, my friend Lois Takahashi. What would you recommend to cities that are interested in measuring and dashboarding local prosperity?
Well, I would say hi, Lois. I would say two things. One is, that I think what politicians tend to want to measure is jobs, the number of jobs. Like economic developers are often measured on the number of jobs they supposedly create. That leads to cheating, for one thing, about how many jobs you're creating, but it also it says it doesn't matter. So I think I would measure not only the number of jobs, but the quality of those jobs, the pay of those jobs. I would also try to measure wealth creation as opposed to job creation. I think that I would also try to measure the geographical distribution of where the people who have good jobs live, and try to use that as an equity tool.
Makes sense to me. Steven Svet has Sweet. Man, I'm killing it today with the names. To your points, I live in a city with many natural amenities: surfing, mountain biking, endless redwood forests, organic food abundance. The name of that city is Santa Cruz. That sounds accurate to me. Santa Cruz has long attracted innovators and entrepreneurs, so our problems are different than places that struggle with economic development. So how does Omaha compete? What about Erie, Pennsylvania? How do places that won't attract Yvonne Chouinard move toward a more prosperous future?
Well, fortunately, not all entrepreneurs like to surf. And I would make a couple of points. One is that, and I think those of us, and I will count myself among this group, who live in coastal California, tend to think that other places do not have natural place amenities. And this is not true. Erie has lousy weather. It's also on a lake. Right. And if you've ever lived in Cleveland, you realize that there are, and Erie's near Cleveland, there are a lot of place amenities along the south shore of Lake Erie. Omaha similarly is a river town, but I think there are a couple things that built place becomes more important, right? One of the things I found in the Texas-California conversation is that urban planners in Texas, particularly those who are new urbanists, tend to want to try to build they tend to want to try to build noticeable things, terminating vistas and so forth. And that's because in Texas you don't have any hills. So I think in the middle of the country, built places become more important, but also natural places. Natural place amenities are greater in the middle of the country than everybody thinks. Don't underestimate either the power of growing up in a particular location. And to give you an example, my favorite example is Doug Burgum, who is now the governor of North Dakota. Doug Burgum grew up in Fargo. He went to Stanford. He worked in Silicon Valley, and he decided, I want to give something back to my hometown. And he moved back to Fargo and started Great Plains Software, which he sold to Microsoft for $1 billion on the condition that Microsoft never moved away from Fargo. So I think the human or sociological factor becomes more important. The place amenities become more important. And the other thing I think we've realized during COVID is that cost plus place amenities actually matter. You want to find walkability, you want to find some urban stuff, you want to find a river, you want to find a lake, and you want to find it in a place that is not super expensive. I think we're finding that more and more.
Linda Wheaton has a question. What are your thoughts on the inability of our regulatory systems to actually implement plans and build things in less than a decade or more?
Well, it's funny because I think, as Linda knows, I've been working with the Turner Center on a variety of reports on whether or not these new housing production laws, which you, Mike, have written about so much, are actually making any difference. And I think that the fact of the matter is that there is considerable impatience with our inability to implement plans, and that is this is what's leading to this zoning reform. And I do think that, and I do think, as I say, that Houston is the great model and the great example for that, like I said before.
Cool. So one more question from the audience, Eric Yost. As places like Scotland, New Zealand, and Australia have built into their government proactive community wealth building as an alternative to traditional economic development. Chicago is one of the few U.S. cities integrating community wealth building to counter detrimental effects of traditional economic and community development. What are your thoughts on community wealth building as opposed to these traditional forms of economic and community development?
I think some measure, and I say this as somebody who's of Scottish ancestry and pays close attention to Scotland, and I'm looking forward, by the way, to the next independence vote. But I think it's I think community wealth building is one necessary strategy. I always say, going back to the very beginning of my talk when I talked about economic development, there is no silver bullet for economic development. There is no single strategy that works better than any other. I do think that, traditional economic development, business recruitment and expansion has a role to play. I'll come back to that in a minute. Community development has a role to play, although oftentimes the end result of that has been to concentrate more affordable housing in neighborhoods that are already relatively poor. So I think it's vital that we find ways for wealth to be reinvested in the communities where it is created. I would say a variation on traditional economic development, I would say, is that I always say, and this is a different form of wealth building. It's not financial wealth, but I would often say the most important thing about economic development is not what business you attract, but what's left behind the day after the business leaves. So I grew up in a town that was impoverished because the businesses it relied on left, and that town now, 40 years after all those factories left, has a manufacturing output, punches far above its weight with manufacturing output. And a lot of folks who live in that town still have good manufacturing jobs, not as many of them as there used to be. So one of the things that I would say is to understand the assets that are being created through the process of economic development. In Auburn, people have been making things for 200 years. They know how to make things. They like making things. If you can connect them with the resources they need to start businesses and to start manufacturing things and exporting that, then that's an asset. Those people are there. They're not just an older population that has never left. There's a considerable entrepreneurial spirit there. So I think that traditional economic development has a role to play. Traditional community development has a role to play. And there's no question that community wealth building and other, I'll call it anti-gentrification steps, play a role. I said before that I'm often overwhelmed by the income inequality and the effect that has on the economic segregation of our cities. One of the things I do say in the book is, I don't think that means you should not seek to overcome that with things like community benefits agreements. I think it is important, particularly for large institutions, and I just saw my former employer Rice go through this, to engage in those conversations, to engage surrounding neighborhoods and invest in them in meaningful ways that benefit the community and that the community is a part of. But again, that's one of many things that needs to happen. As I say, I don't think there's a silver bullet that solves any of this problem.
So, I want to end with a bit of a big picture or forward-looking question, and it's inspired by very kind of hot off the presses story from the New York Times about kind of the ghost town or the end of downtown San Francisco, at least
the urban doom loop.
Yeah. So this is, of course, in part a post-COVID sort of story or a effect of the pandemic on our city's question. My thinking continues to evolve as we get more data, but but you finish this book, Place and Prosperity, on this topic of kind of the pandemic's effects on cities. So kind of where are you at in your evolution on how you think this last 2+ years we've been through will or won't kind of transform our cities?
I think what's going to happen is that both cities and suburbs are going to have to have a more diverse set of activities. Downtown San Francisco or Midtown Manhattan is not going to be able to prosper off of millions of office workers arriving every day anymore. One of the big challenges, I think, is how do you convert older office buildings to residential in these locations, which is something that has been successfully done in downtown LA, but has not been widely copied. At the same time, I think suburbs are going to have to, I hate to say it this way, this is going to sound dumb, but become more interesting. Suburbs, people are going to spend more time, people who used to commute are now going to spend more time in suburbs. And so I think that they are going to have to, I think suburbs are going to have to accommodate a much larger, and suburbs narrowly and traditionally defined were really just locations where a family lived, breadwinners left, kids were educated, and that was about it. And people shopped on the weekend. That was about it. I think suburbs are, and again, there's a big equity question here, right? But suburbs to survive and to thrive, I think, are going to have to become more interesting places for people to spend their time, because they're spending more time there, and I think their expectations are going to change. I just have been doing some work through PFM for Nassau County on Long Island. Nassau County, which is basically a bedroom suburb for Manhattan, 20% of the employed people in Nassau County now work at home. And so I don't think that, having lunch at the neighborhood Applebee's is going to suffice, right?
Yeah.
So I think both cities and suburbs are going to have to learn to be back to what we started talking about, Mike, much more self-contained communities. If people are not commuting as much as don't need to, if white collar workers, I'll emphasize that, are not commuting as much as they used to, then they are much more likely to successfully live in a self-contained place. And so these partial communities that we've created, both in cities and suburbs, have to become more well-rounded.
Yeah, that's sounds about right to me. And some of that I certainly didn't really think about. As usual, cities continue to evolve as you
Right. They always evolve. They always evolve.
Cool, man. This has been such a good conversation.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
I'm glad I was able to helicopter back in for it. I want to, first thank Bill, of course. It's really an amazing opportunity to be able to, ask somebody like Bill just pretty much any question on cities, and he can give you some fresh thinking on it. And that's really amazing. I want to make sure to point out a couple of upcoming events that Maddie was gracious enough to throw in the chat. I'm sure folks can see that, but next week we have an important discussion on homelessness and what we are hoping to do about that. That's on February 16th. So the link is in the chat there. And then Maddie also mentioned a March 2nd event that UCLA Luskin is holding on Mike Davis and honoring his life and work. And just to make sure to repeat, you can find Bill's book, Place and Prosperity, through Island Press. If you use the code Fulton, I believe you get 20% off. Do I have that right, Bill?
That's correct.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you to the audience for joining us. And again, a special thanks to UCLA's own Bill Fulton for joining us for a fun and super informative conversation. And
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciated the opportunity to read the book too, Bill.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye.